Hello, Blythe, Evie, Joe, Jack, Callum, Cadence, Lucy, Orion, and anyone else who's listening. Welcome to Story Time. Today's story is The Story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford. The Story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford, and it is a scholastic book. This is a true story, so it's very interesting to see how brave children can be. It's dedicated to Ruby Bridges Hall and to all who did as she did for the United States of America by Robert Coles, and to my wife, Burnett, who relived Ruby's ordeal with me, by the illustrator George Ford. There's something written by Ruby's mother. Our Ruby taught us all a lot. She became someone who helped change our country. She was part of history, just like generals and presidents are part of history. There are leaders, and so was Ruby. She led us away from hate, and she led us nearer to knowing each other, the white folks and the black folks. Ruby's mother. So, let's begin. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops. So my daddy lost his job. And that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. So look, Ruby's mom is telling her good night, and then she's going to go work all night long. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's laws. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were sent to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to 1st grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. So Ruby was the only one who went to that school. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in American history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said, that we'd all be strong and we'd have courage and we'd get through any trouble. And Ruby would be a good girl and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the France Elementary School. The people carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns. Do you see the men? There's two men in this picture with yellow bands around their arms. Those are federal marshals who are there to keep Ruby safe. Every day for weeks that turned into months, Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the France school surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone, except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite, and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So, Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat here all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was doing fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide that she no longer wanted to go to school. Then, one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped. right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her what happened. Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she'd been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in the mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." Every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. After she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you." Wow. I cannot imagine what it was like to be Ruby Bridges. This is an afterword. That means it tells you what happened after a while and what Ruby Bridges is doing now. Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at the France Elementary School. Their parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when the first white students went back to school, but those boys were soon joined by other children. We've been sitting back and letting our children get cheated out of an education because some people have tried to take the law into their own hands, one parent said. It's time for us to fight for the side of the law and for our children's right to go to a school and get their education. They all did get their education. Ruby and a growing number of boys and girls went to the school with her. By the time Ruby was in the 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's order that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. Year after year, Ruby went to the France school. She graduated from it, then went on to graduate from high school. Ruby Bridges is married to a building contractor and has 4 sons. She's a successful businesswoman, and she created the Ruby Bridges Educational Foundation. It focuses on education, community, and the future of our nation's children. The foundation is especially dedicated to revitalizing the William Frantz School, which is located in the heart of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. When Hurricane Katrina hit, Ruby Bridges once again stepped to the forefront and embraced the opportunity to make history again by contributing to the challenges that the country and her city were facing recovering from Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and really did a lot of damage. There is also a special exhibit featuring Ruby's story at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis in Indianapolis, Indiana, called The Power of Children, Making a Difference. And we've seen that. Remember when we visited the Children's Museum in Indianapolis? We'll have to go back and see that again. This is about the author. He has received the Pulitzer Prize, which is a big deal. And he's the author of many books for adults. And he's also a psychiatrist at Harvard University and lives in Boston, Massachusetts. And the illustrator, George Ford, has illustrated many books for children, and including Ray Charles and Paul Robeson, and he's been the winner of the Jane Addams Children's Book Award. He lives with his wife and daughter in Brooklyn, New York. And here is his drawing of Ruby Bridges walking away from school. I hope you like that story. I hope you realize how brave children can be and what a big difference children can make in the world when they just summon their courage and do what is hard for any person, big or small. I hope you like that story. I hope you're still taking good care of yourselves, loving on each other. Always love yourself just the way you are, and never forget how very brave each one of you is. And never forget, I love each one of you to the moon and back. We'll be back again for story time on Monday when we read another story. Bye-bye.